Yep, great. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jeremy Zettermeier. I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm super excited today that we have a spectacular event on, the probably the most important topic in Europe and arguably the US right now, the future of AI. Now that we have recovered from the Greenland shock, we can get back to the really important stuff, which is basically AI and Ukraine. Those are the two only issues that matter. And so there's hardly a bigger deal. And so this has to do with two facts. I mean, we obviously have great hopes for the future. We're also maybe a little bit terrified, but we mostly have hopes. We can already see enormous growth impact, so particularly in the US. There's this famous quote by Jason Furman. I think he actually made it when he was here at the Bruegel annual meeting, saying that in the first half of 25, virtually all of the growth in the US was attributable to AI-related investment to data centers, mainly. Then there is also an important point that the managing director of the IMF mentioned when she was here on Monday to do her sort of Davos debrief, where we asked her, look, why is the world economy so resilient, even though we've had all this volatility and shocks? And she said three factors. Number one, tariffs weren't as bad as we thought. Second, institutions have generally worked well in buffering these shocks, and she meant mainly central banks. And third, AI, right? So there's been this sort of strong wind holding up the world economy. But then another reason why we are sort of a little concerned in Europe, other than the fear of AI itself, is this notion that it will magnify our productivity gap, right? So it's well known that the productivity gap, growth gap that we've had with respect to the US, of course, it depends on many factors, but in an accounting sense, you can explain it by an ICT adoption gap, which has lasted about 20 years now. And so now imagine that AI further increases growth in the US, but not so much in Europe. We're going to get an even bigger gap. And so the main point of today's panel is what we can do to prevent it, and so how we can excel in AI. And so we have really the best possible panel for that. So I'm going to introduce you now, okay? So, okay, end of preliminaries. So I'm going to introduce the whole panel because that makes it easier. So we have Chris Lehane, Chief Global Affairs Officer of OpenAI. So super happy to have you. And previously long career in tech and consulting. You were on the executive management team of Airbnb. But importantly for me, because I'm sort of a 90s guy, I was in the US at the time. You served in the White House under President Clinton. And as a press secretary to Vice President Al Gore, who, apart from Obama, is probably the most popular politician, a US politician in Europe ever. And I think with some reason. He's a great guy. Okay, then we have Simon Bunel. So Simon is not super famous yet. He's not as famous as his co-author Philippe Aghion. He will be after the panel. Well, he's becoming more famous by the day because every time Philippe Aghion gives one of his Nobel speeches, he mentions Simon as one of his critical co-authors, so both on papers relating to the productivity growth effect. So Simon co-wrote, and I suspect you did most of the work in this paper, debunking Acemoglu, which is, so Daron Acemoglu, who we enormously respect and love, and is one of the greatest economists in the world, came up with this provocative paper saying the growth impacts of AI are going to be small, and he did this using a growth accounting framework, in effect. And what's great about Simon's paper is he uses exactly the same framework, but essentially parameterizes these effects differently and decomposes them, and then he shows that Daron systematically erred on the lower side, and so it's a great paper. It's not published, but you can get it anywhere. And then Simon has also done great work on the labor market impact of AI, also with Philippe Aghion, but also with other friends of ours like Alexandre Roulet, who is a non-resident fellow here as well. We have Dominic King, who leads the research team in Accenture, particularly on AI, and his recent work has focused mostly on the impact of AI on firm and European competitiveness, and so he's the co-author of a recent benchmark report called Europe's AI Reckoning, Reinventing Industries for a New Era, which came out about half a year ago, so hot, almost still hot off the press. And then finally we have Deborah, who is here so often that I don't need to introduce her. So she's the chief economist and director of the economics department of the EIB. And when she's here, she talks a lot about growth and business environment, but she also talks about investment a lot. And of course, investment is a key part of this story. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start with Chris. We're going to give Chris about 10 minutes to introduce his findings from the latest OpenAI report on the AI capability overhang, which is essentially about adoption, right? It's why adoption isn't going faster than it is and how to do it. We're then going to have a panel discussion on these matters, both on adoption and on tech sovereignty, and then we will hand it to we will ask for questions. Chris, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. I'm not sure if the microphone is working.
Yeah, surprisingly, it starts working once you use it.
Does it really? My wife would love that. First of all, thank you all for being here. First of all, an incredible panel, Deborah, Dominic, Simone. Really look forward to the conversation, and being in the esteemed hands of the director here is always fantastic. When I was coming on the flight over I was in Berlin earlier, and I was thinking about being at Bruegel. It took me back my last semester of my senior year in college. I ended up taking this incredible course on Flemish art. And I had this image, and Olga, who works with me, reminded me of this piece of art that we had studied when I was in this class, and that was one of Bruegel's pieces where it has Icarus crashing. And I was trying to wonder if that was maybe a metaphor in some shape, way, or form. Okay, good. Okay, but what's really cool about Bruegel, I think we actually share this in common. This may be a little bit of a stretch, but with OpenAI, which is, I think, what makes this group really special, and all the people in the room and the panels. You're not only doing the analysis, sort of what maybe you think about as the academic piece, but you're really connecting it to actually government policies. And so in many respects, similar to OpenAI, you're both a research laboratory, but you're also deploying the work that you do to actually impact real-world outputs. So it's a real pleasure to be here. As you noted, I'm going to walk through some slides here. A little bit of context, some of this you probably know about OpenAI, but then really get into the overhang capability that we've been talking about. So who is OpenAI? Why should I care about AI? I think it's actually worth thinking about this in the historical context here in Europe. And then how do we think about AI for Europe? So quickly, OpenAI, many of you know this, right? We were originally, as I was just stating, founded as a research laboratory nonprofit back in 2015. Think of it as like a massive science experiment or science project. 2022, right? Chat 3.5 comes out. There have been other versions of it, and overnight, OpenAI becomes like a household name. And then just this past November, pretty big moment for us. We did a corporate restructure where running a third of our economics are controlled by a nonprofit, and something called a public benefits corporation stands underneath of it. To give just a sense of our size, right, and how fast we grew. Fastest growing technology company in history, and just even a sense of how big we are and scaled we are today. Like, one of my favorite stats is there's almost 30,000 chats every second taking place, and this stat is probably 4 or 5 months old, so it's probably even bigger at this point. We continue to be blessed and humbled to be the innovation leader in the space. And just even simply because I think this is going to be relevant to part of the European conversation, like the economic model, which I think is really important here. And the simplistic version of it is, for basically every quantum of compute, we drive 3x users, 3x revenue. Compute does end up being the scarcest resource and arguably the most important resource as you think about the intelligence age. Our mission is to build AI that's going to benefit everyone. That means democracy by design, our corporate structure. It means putting the tools into the hands for people to be able to actually access it, and the opportunity that comes from that. So why should I care about this? I mean, this is a really sophisticated crowd, but I think you all understand that this is a general purpose technology. Examples of that, and Simone, I'm sure this is stuff that's really inherent to the work that you're doing, particularly thinking about the balance between capital and labor. But the wheel, the car, the combustion engine, transistors, and AI. And if you look at the course of sort of progress of humans, for about 90,000 years, it was a pretty static line in terms of progress from an economic perspective. And then these general purpose technologies started to kick in, and under any definition, it certainly measured in economic opportunity, economic progress. They have driven enormous progress for humans. For a big chunk of our existence, we basically were able to produce equivalent to what we ate. And general purpose technology has just fundamentally changed that. And as I said earlier, the key here is the research, and then how the research relates to how you deploy this to actually use this general purpose technology to really create economic opportunity. And I do think Europe is very much in a moment here on this technology. And as I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, there were I'm a history major, and I think of myself as very much of an amateur, stress an amateur historian. I get to play technologist at events like this, but I'm really more of an amateur historian. And there are two historical lessons that I was thinking about when I thought about Europe when it comes to a general productive technology like this. The first is the car. Europe actually did the research and the innovation to produce the first real cars. They were in France, they were in England, but in a lot of those places, Germany as well, right? Laws were passed that actually really limited the ability of it to be deployed at scale. I mean, it's the infamous red flag laws, where in England, you actually, the law required you to have a driver, someone next to the driver in case something happened, and then someone walking in front of you waving a red flag, so you couldn't pass a horse, right? But then I thought of another historical analogy, and that is the printing press. Developed in Europe, Gutenberg had some role in it. But when the printing press came out, if you looked across the whole world, socioeconomically, basically in the same general condition. Europe, in some regards, because the Catholic Church existed here, had a baseline of literacy. And as a result of that literacy and building up on it, there was an explosion of growth here. I mean, you can trace the Enlightenment, Age of Discovery, Age of Science, to the literacy that existed, and this printing press being able to share and spread knowledge, democratize learning. And then you compare it to a place like China at the time, which actually took explicit steps to stop literacy. It was a potential threat to the dynasty. And the two very different directions those two parts of the world went in. And I do think that in many regards, we're sort of calling that question right now. Is Europe going to go in the direction of the red flag laws, or is Europe going to do what it did when the printing press came along and really think about the opportunity that exists here? And so, as you were mentioning, we were in Davos last week, and we shared out some data that I think does speak to this moment. What we shared is that a typical power user on OpenAI using chat and some of our other technologies is effectively getting a 7x multiplier on their economic productivity. If you think about this as an employee in a company, like that is the value that they are producing relative to someone who isn't a power user. And then we even took a look at it from like a nation level perspective and saw that those nations that are both adopting and adapting meaning higher levels of use, adapting meaning really using the technology, we're seeing a 3x increase. And what we took away from that is the following. There's this capability overhang, and to unpack that's a bunch of fancy words. The short version of it is that technology continues to scale. It continues to accelerate. Those who are adopting and adapting are getting tremendous economic value out of that. But those who are not, whether it's an individual, a company, or a country, are potentially going to be experiencing a real opportunity gap as we go forward here. And so for us, a big part of what we want to focus this year and going forward on is how do we close that gap for individuals, for people? How do we close it for companies? How do we close it for countries? And I think this is the conversation that needs to take place, here in Europe. Generally speaking, we have over 800 million people who are using this on a daily basis. Europe is one of our biggest markets in the world. 95% of them, are using it for free. That's part of the access piece of this. But if you look at Europe from from the perspective of how companies are using this, I think this is really an important piece and maybe the most important data piece for this whole conversation. But in Europe, you have larger companies that are beginning to experiment with this, but the smaller companies, I was in Germany yesterday, the Mittelstand, right? Those mid-sized and small companies that are really the backbone of the European economy and European society are really trailing far behind. And so as you think about the adoption and adaption, I think there needs to be a real enormous focus on this particular area. And then when you think about, from a country level perspective, good news is Europe is about 17% ahead of the rest of the world in accessing the intelligence that comes from these systems, but it's not evenly distributed. Happy to share the slide. It's in our report that we're releasing. But you can basically see the 4 quadrants and sort of see some countries that may surprise you are doing pretty well, some that may surprise you are not doing as well. But even this breaks down a little bit along the lines of some places are actually over-indexing but not using it to its fullest capabilities. And so it's not just the adoption, it is the adaption of the cutting-edge technology. And specifically, for those who are familiar with how ChatGPT works, we have a level called reasoning. And reasoning is sort of the, one of the more powerful ways to be able to use the AI. Some people are just using it like as a basic search tool, but not using it for the reasoning capabilities that come with it. And so how do we think about AI for Europe? But we're releasing, as part of this conversation, a blueprint today. It's Economic Blueprint 2.0 last year, and I think you and I chatted about this a little bit last year. We released 1.0, and it was really sort of in advance of the AI action plan that the EU was putting out and even the code of practice. At that time, we called for a 3x investment in infrastructure, literacy for 100 million folks, focusing on the startup community. But as we get here today, and we're seeing this capability overhang and the imperative of addressing the opportunity gap, we are sort of updating our economic blueprint. So this is 2.0. And what it's going to do is, first of all, it is going to continue to scale the work we've been doing on infrastructure, but it's going to build out some specific elements. We're going to focus on education, healthcare, startups, cybersecurity, and also disaster relief. We just brought on George Osborne, who many of you probably know, former Exchequer Finance Minister of the UK. He's going to oversee this work for us. We are going to have a very specific focus on trying to scale some of the opportunities. We, over the last year, ran a number of pilots. You can almost think about these as sort of laboratories in democracy for AI, but education programs in Greece, Slovakia, Estonia, startups in a number of places, including Greece, and our infrastructure, number of infrastructure projects, an SAP project in Germany, one in the Netherlands, but we want to scale that work. And then in particular, and I had flagged this earlier, is really how we think about these small and medium enterprises, the folks who do make up the backbone of Europe. It could be artisans in Italy, family farms in France, shopkeepers in the UK, developers in Estonia, entrepreneurs in Poland, the Mittelstand in Germany. Today we're announcing that we're going to be pursuing a program across 6 of those countries to really focus on how we can start to build AI into those small and medium-sized companies. We're going to look to do 20,000 over the course of the year. To be clear, this is not the solution to that 17 versus 52%, but can we learn lessons from this that we're able to share and apply, hopefully be able to come back here at some point and share out what we learn. Big takeaway for this group and hopefully for the conversation is we are in this moment where Europe gets to choose whether it wants to go the direction of the red flag laws and the car example or the printing press. And I think it is prepared to make the right decisions so that you're going to have AI of, for, and by Europe to create the economic opportunity that this productivity-generating technology can deliver for everyday people. Thanks for having me.
Super. Thank you so much, Chris. So a lot of the rest of the panel is how we move there, right? Maybe just one question for clarification. So when you said only 17% of SMEs use it, so this presumably refers to AI being used in a way that is, in a sense, reflected by management of these companies, right? And as part of the business purpose, this is not about individuals using it.
That's right. It's a really good point. I mean, take Germany, where I know the numbers off the top of my head. By the way, Olga can't stop me from using numbers now because she's a little ways away from me. But in Germany, I think roughly a third of the adult population use ChatGPT like on a regular basis. Right. But only but their SMEs are about 17%, right? And so one of the interesting dynamics, and I think you're hitting on this, is how can you bring what people are already doing in their regular life and bring it into these companies?
It will help a lot,
yeah.
I think.
Yes.
No? Because they already know that there is a use case in some
So the baseline
context.
of literacy, that's why I think the printing press example is on point. Like, EU
Right.
as a whole has a higher level of AI literacy than a lot of other parts of the world.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to go to the panelists, and maybe to start with Simon, because your work has been so basic. So, there's a promise related to AI adoption. We have some fears that particularly have to do with labor market displacement. You have worked on both. Can you just give us the highlights, but please make it brief, because I know these are like about 5 papers that you have written, and so you could go through them in great detail.
Yeah, so sorry, thank you for inviting me. So on productivity, so you gave some highlights of the debate we had with Daron Acemoglu, and I think I will follow Chris' line and take some historical examples. I think our debate is about assembly line, like AI as the equivalent of assembly lines 100 years after that, and what happens if we just automate tasks given AI? And we have this debate because we have the same model, and I think the debate we have with Daron Acemoglu is that if we take all the lower bounds, assuming no progress in AI capabilities, then you find a very small potential of 0.07 percentage point per year. If you take all the upper bound, which is also a big hypothesis, you have 1.3 percentage point per year. Main message, we don't really know actually, because the range is so huge, so we don't know. We know it's not like 5%. And then it brings me to the second point. Another historical example would be the microscope. AI could help researchers to be more productive. It's not automating tasks for producing goods and services. It's making researchers more productive, having more innovation, more ideas. And if you do this in a growth model, then you have more growth on the long run. And then you can have tremendous.
So that would be a growth effect as opposed to a levels effect.
Exactly. And then it's cumulative, so it's crazy. So, and that's why you could expect like 5% growth. This we don't know because it's so new. It's the first time in history that you have both microscope and assembly lines at the same time. It's crazy. And on the labor part, so if we look in the past on the data we have, is that actually if you adopt AI, firms that adopt AI, they increase their employment. Is that what you mentioned? If you are not adopting AI, you lose market share from your competitors, and that's where you lose employment. But what's interesting is that if you consider jobs that are particularly exposed to AI, like secretaries or this kind of jobs, even for those jobs, employment is increasing, but not always. If you use AI to automate on the assembly line, for instance, then you will just scale up, and you will need more secretaries, more accountants, and for those jobs, it's profitable. But if you use AI to target specific jobs, then you have a negative impact for those jobs. So the European question we have around regulation, it's not we should regulate the technology. We should think on how to adopt AI. Which AI do we really want? And I think that's also your message. We need to think how to build AI with what people really need.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Dominic, so I mentioned the report you just came out with a few months ago. So you go, I think you do a stock take of adoption, and you do go through the main barriers to AI adoption in European companies. And so what are the barriers, and what, if anything, can EU policymakers do about them?
Yeah, I think it's important just to ground ourselves on where AI can and add the most value for an organization. This builds on what Simon and Chris have said. Companies need to be scaling big bets with AI. What do I mean by a big bet? Well, I'm going to dramatically oversimplify just for clarity. Level 1 and level 2, right? Level 1 is you layer AI onto your existing processes. You make them incrementally better and you deliver incremental value. Level 2, you fundamentally reimagine an entire function or an entire process with AI at the core, and you deliver incredibly, high levels of value, much more productivity. You really move the needle. Just as an example, think about drug discovery in life sciences, right? So very uncertain process, long process, costly process, right? It's about 7% of drugs make it to market, and it takes about 10 to 12 years on average. So you might say it's ripe for reinvention, right? Level 1, you maintain the same drug discovery process, but use a bit of AI to help with the data analysis, right, from drug trials. Incrementally better, incremental improvement in value and productivity. Level 2, you fundamentally redesign the R&D process. So you perhaps start with the data and get a lot more targeted in terms of what you're trying to do. More targeted trials, more targeted development, more efficient. And we reckon that probably, on average, would knock about 25 to 30% off timelines and costs done well. So coming back to your point, Jeremy, the issue we see in Europe is not enough companies are taking these big bets. In fact, fewer than half of large companies, and bearing in mind we were doing billion euro plus companies, fewer than half have scaled a big bet when we did the work. And there are probably three lessons or three elements to add a bit of nuance to what they're doing and gets me onto some of the barriers. The first one ties in with Chris's point, size. So size matters enormously when it comes to AI. We split the companies between 10 billion euro plus and lower, and the gap is tremendous. It's not quite as big as that gap, but it's exactly the same sort of idea. And as I said, the lowest we went down was about a billion euros. There's a 50% uptick in terms of scaling of big bets between the very large and the large. And it also makes it changes the narrative slightly around Europe. The narrative is that Europe is always behind. Larger companies, Europe is not behind. The very largest companies are scaling AI on par with their US competitors. The issue is that level down, exactly as you said, Chris. Smaller companies are not. They don't have the resources. They don't have the AI specialists. They don't have the change management capabilities. The resources to be able to run multiple pilots and see loads of them fail. So size is one element. Sector's another element. We saw very strong adoption in sectors like automotive and A&D, aerospace and defense, and life sciences. And we saw pretty weak adoption, sort of 10 to 20% in critical infrastructure sectors, telcos, energy, utilities. The sort of sectors that Mr. Draghi might say are ripe for consolidation, right? Big opportunity for Europe is in industrial, we think. The way we define it, it counts for about 27% of European GDP, which is actually bigger relative to the US. Europe is a world leader in areas like automation solutions, industrial software, and increasingly in robotics. And you just have to look at what Siemens are doing in Erlangen to understand, the potential of some of this. And the final point is on strategy. The barriers that we see companies facing. First one is technology infrastructure, right? A lot of these companies are trying to use AI on legacy systems, right? Which is hampering information flows. It's like trying to run Photoshop or Illustrator on the Amstrad you've got out in your garage, right? It's going to be glitchy at best. It's not going to work. The second point is around data and data management. What we found, and this is from all the various work we do with clients, is that data tends to be siloed in lots of organizations. It doesn't necessarily talk to each other very well. It can be unreliable. If data's the new oil, this is like going out there and imagine you're trying to drill for oil in lots of different places, really big area, really tiny wells, and then when you pull all the oil together, it's of different grades and you can't really use it. It needs extra refining. The point really is that you need to get your data management, data governance processes right. And the very final point, and again, this builds on the point you were making, Chris, and ties into what Simon was saying, is around people. There's huge amounts of investment that companies are making in AI, but the lion's share, the largest proportion is going on the technology, not the people. Right, so we're at this position where, according to our latest research, about less than 25% of European employees feel confident using AI tools. 24% it is. Feel confident, fully confident using AI tools, right? So, we're not going to move the needle on productivity with that kind of issue. One of the issues sitting behind that is that they don't feel that their employers are being fully transparent around what the advent of AI means for jobs and skills. So if you're, and I think it's only 15% feel fully confident their employers are being transparent with them. If you're sitting there and you feel that by using AI you're self-cannibalizing your role, you're not really going to go full throttle at the technology. And the point is that you can build the shiniest, smartest, cleverest tool in the world. If no one uses it, then it's never going to move the needle on productivity.
Actually, a question to you both. So, talked a lot about Europe so far. What are SMEs better adopters in the US? Do you have also like a US baseline for to compare those results with, or not?
No, we don't. It's not clear what the issue. I mean, as you well know, is the fragmentation. The fact that businesses in Europe tend to be smaller, and tend to be smaller.
But we have, I mean, for a given size, right? There's an SME in the US as well. Do they tend to do better on adoption?
I think what we've seen in the US is, and this relates a little bit to your observation earlier, which is individual users really aggressively bringing it in to their businesses, but the businesses sort of having and I'm not sure if this is exactly the right way to say it, but sort of more embracing of bringing it in. We have done a bunch of projects in the U.S. to actually sort of start to train small businesses. It's been a big part of our focus. I think the reason that and this is sort of picking up on what both Simone and Dominic said, which is that those SMEs here are just particularly important. I do think, and Dominic, I think you were really making this point, Simone, when you sort of did the assembly line microscope sort of in a way, which is, the U.S. went through a quote-unquote China shock in the 90s. Like where I grew up in the state of Maine, it lost a lot of manufacturing businesses. I think Europe has held on to a stronger manufacturing base at some, and I'm saying this as an American, many in this room will know this much better than me, but at least as I understand it, because you had these sort of mid-sized companies that were delivering incredibly high quality on the engineering, the precision.
In a small niche.
Right,
yeah.
but really effective at that. And I think the opportunity here is to sort of help them use this technology to continue to do it. It's a challenge to build it in, as both of you have flagged. The reverse of this is that you're beginning to feel a China shock in Europe already. I mean, Germany is certainly, and you can imagine both a China shock and a GPU shock, right? Which is the China shock already hitting, and then the GPU shock, which is which parts of the world actually have access to GPUs to have the AI infrastructure that is needed, assuming you're even getting the adoption. So you've got both of these dynamics in play here, and because this part of the economy is so important to the culture and society here, right. I do think it's a real area for focus. And you can almost imagine, and I know different countries would think about this differently, but is there some version of like a real industrial policy to actually start to get at this sector of the economy?
Right. Deborah, this is not my main question to you yet, but I remember that in the EIB investment survey, you have a baseline for U.S. companies, right? Can you say something about the U.S.-Europe comparison on adoption?
Yes. So I think we have just to say we have this survey that we run since 10 years, and it's 12,000 firms. It also has it's mostly European, but it has 1,000 firms in the U.S. that tries to match the market. So the U.S. is less deep than what we have on the European side. But since 4 or 5 years, we are asking questions on the digitalization of firms, exactly what kind of digital technology they use and for what. And we also have generative AI among the questions. And we have all the balance sheet of the data, of the firm attached. So we have the way to compare US. What we see is very much, I think everything that you say, they can confirm, but I can add also the comparison. I think the level of digitalization that we see is similar, actually. Not digitalization, adoption is the same in the US overall. The big difference, and I think it was already said, is on the extensive use. So whether companies use for more than one activities or only for one activities. And that's the big difference between EU and US. In Europe, it's like a 50% use AI more than in 50% of those that use AI use it for more than one activities. In the US is 80%. And that's also in the SME difference, we see the same. There is also in the US, but I think this part of the extensive use is stronger in the US. We also do a very similar analysis on the impact of AI on productivity. We come also similar numbers, so not different. Also in terms of the impact on SME, actually what we see is that the impact of in terms of TFP, of AI adoption, is higher in larger firms, but is also present in smaller firms. So it really calls on which policy you want to implement.
Right. Actually, do you want to come in, Chris? No. I did want to talk about policy a little bit, so I'm going to go back to Dominic and then come to you with more or less the same question. So if I listen to you well, a lot of your answers have to do with essentially firm learning, right? And, you know, some firms, so far, I think a lot of this US versus European difference can be explained through just the general penetration of information technology in US society. And of course, I worked as Director General for Economic Policy in the German Ministry for Economic Affairs 10 years ago, and we had exactly the same problem with things like the Internet of Things, right? We're trying to teach German SMEs to just adopt more technology, and they were resistant, and a lot of this has to do with inherent conservatism that comes from family management, right? So that is a big one, and it's true also for Italy. So here, you know, our answer as social democrats back then was, let's get brutal about inheritance laws and have more, you know, that's a way where, you know, inheritance taxation can actually give you turnover, force professional management and so forth. But this has nothing to do with the type of the policies that everyone thinks of, right? So we are thinking about single market stuff, and then if we come to things like the printing press and the red flag analogy, we're thinking about the state getting in the way through regulation. Now, I'm sure those arguments are important, but they seem to apply more to barriers to generating AI. So this is the AI Act, possibly, right? So the more proactive European approach to regulation, as opposed to sort of let them do what they want, and then you crack down in case someone goes off the rails, right? Which is more the US approach. So all these things it's an important discussion. We should have it. We will have it in a second. But so far, from everything I had heard, it's not really a policy issue in the sense that, you know, policy could be more proactive in you know, taking SMEs by the hand, which is what OpenAI is trying to do, right? And help them learn. But it's not really the red flag analogy, right? That you're trying to actively constrain the dissemination of the technology. So everyone wants to be in the printing press world, also the European policymakers. Is that correct? Or where would you see the policy lessons for the types of adoption issues that you studied, Dominic?
I mean, the barriers we hear from a policy angle will be very familiar to everyone. It's lack of risk capital, it's planning, and it's energy, right? But I think what we hear from businesses is in terms of regulation, is they want certainty. You know, way back when I used to work a lot on the transfer pricing stuff, when that sort of all that regulation was coming in, and countries, you know, companies paying different tax rates in different jurisdictions. You know, when certainty comes in and businesses can have things in black and white, it's actually a lot easier for them to then invest and make
that's generic business environment, right? That's not particularly anti-AI. So we are thinking about the, you know, lack of comparative advantage on AI in Europe. We always think of three things. One, maybe we regulate too much. Second, our data protection is too strong and maybe dysfunctional, and we have written a lot about this. Burton has written about data as a production factor. And number three is the energy prices, right? But those things are really about building data centers, getting, Mistral to compete with OpenAI. It's not so much about adoption, right?
No, and you're right. It was absolutely right. And if there was a fundamental policy issue, then we would see a gap between adoption between when you control for size and industry between the US and Europe. And as I said, in our analysis, we did not find that.
Do you want to come in on this, and then maybe Simon? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe thinking in terms of the adoption, the analysis that we are doing, but also comparing with my operational colleagues that finance projects, a lot of innovation and AI projects all over Europe. The barriers that we see are really the normal barrier to innovation, like the business environment regulation, business regulation, etc. It's not the IE regulation, it's really the business environment. There is one element, access to finance seems to be more relevant for firms adopting artificial intelligence rather than digitalization, normal digitalization. And then the other point is it's very important the environment also, like latency time, so the whole connectivity framework. And on that is interesting because I think for the level of adoption that we see today, Europe is relatively okay, actually. The infrastructure that we see is relatively good. There has been a lot of investment for the level of adoption that we have today. There is the big issue of skills. Skills, I think, are not so present, particularly in the smaller companies. And what we see is that actually when firms invest in AI, they have a much better return if at the same time they invest also in intangibles, so also the reskilling part, etc. So it comes together also on what the firm does in terms of adoption. But I think here we are really talking about the adoption side, and I think on the adoption side,
we'll talk about the other side next.
Yeah,
okay.
because I think it's important to say, and maybe it's the link to the next side. I think Europe in this moment is really betting on the fact that we have a very strong industrial sector, and we can leverage on that to have all the return of the AI. And actually, on that point of view, we also have the enabling infrastructure that is not so bad. We know all the problems. The problem is that we are also building a huge dependency. And what we know from platforms, and that is our normal digitalization, you see that when the firm starts very small, it gets a lot of benefit from adoption. And then the platform start extracting a lot of the benefit. And here we are doing the same.
Okay, very good. We'll go there next, but I want Simon to briefly come in on this topic. Yep.
Just a quick point on this. I mean, regarding adoption policies, there is also the question of the theoretical framework, because innovation policies, it's easy to imagine why we need, because you have a spillover of R&D.
That's right.
So you have all these endogenous growth models like Romer, Philippe Aguillon, they got the Nobel Prize for this. And so because you can't take everything for what you do with your R&D, you need to subsidize it, because if you are not subsidizing it, nobody would do it.
That's
so you subsidize R&D. And innovation.
And we know how to do that
about
in
adoption,
Europe.
it's not clear. I mean, why do you need subsidized adoption? It's a clear technology with clear productivity effects. Why our firms are not adopting it? And why do you need public intervention to... so I think there is a real question on this.
I think you have to move probably to a behavioral economics framework. I mean, your level 1 versus level 2 is really important, right? I mean, because at Bruegel we are level 1, right? I mean, we operate, using best practice. We're like a German SME. We have this best practice. We have our niche. We are the leaders in our thing because we figured out a particular way of doing it. We are terrified to let go of this way. In order to, adapt our processes to AI, you must be kidding. Okay, so we are symptomatic for this approach. And so the question is, how do you make companies take that risk? But you're right, there's no externality, right? So it's a bit unclear where the market failure is. Please.
I say this as an American, I want to recognize that there are people who know this, Europe much better than I do. I think one, Dominic, you did hit on something, which is, I talked about the capability overhang. There's a bit of an investment overhang to sort of the capital formation. And that is, I think, at some level, a derivative of how folks have thought about the regulatory environment over here. That's not to say that what everyone has said is not accurate, right? That you are right on that, but there is sort of a legacy of that. I think too, and Deborah, all of you have made this point. I made the point as well. The economic mix here is just different, which is why I just keep coming back that you do need some version of an industrial policy to think about. And the third thing is really what I think you were saying, and this is less empirical, but and I hate to use the word vibe since it's so overused, so I'll use a different word, which is like the ethos, right? The difference between a level 1 and a level 2 is a really big difference, because this will not just be, the wheel, the combustion, those were not just level 1. You just didn't go a little bit faster, right? Or a little bit farther. Like, it just changed the whole. Think of 1900, you look up at the sky and see a bird. You never thought you could fly. 30 years later, you could fly across the ocean. Like, those are just big changes, right? And so you have to start to think about in that mindset.
And maybe that's more the U.S. mindset.
Yeah.
It could just be the case.
Maybe,
Maybe.
When I
Right?
say that I have European families,
No,
Ireland and Italy.
Sure.
so-
Okay, now let's go to the really hot topic, which is actually producing AI and the so-called tech sovereignty issue. So I'm going to start with you, Chris. So basically, there's the argument that we are too tech dependent on the US, and the question is, how do you rationalize this when really what matters for growth is you get the best technology from wherever you can and you adopt it, right? So it's not so easy to rationalize it, but I think there are maybe 3 stories. I had 2, but since I listened to Deborah, I have a third one now.
That's a good sign.
So one story is that maybe there is a link between a generation of new technology and adopting it, because it leads to this tech mindset, right? So that's a possibility. The second is the point that Deborah made, which is that if we all adopt and then we become heavily dependent on one big supplier, you, OpenAI, are going to screw us, the European consumer. Now, I'm less concerned about that, because what I care about, because the Americans, they would have the same concern. Right, that's an antitrust issue. So as long as there's competition in the US, I'm okay with that. So this doesn't have to do with, we don't need to have the firms here for that effect. We need global competition, right? So less concerned about that. But then, the third one, where I'm heading, right? It's the whole Greenland thing. It's, the guy at the International Court of Justice who lost his email access, maybe it was by mistake. It's essentially, we currently are a little worried about where you guys are going politically, and so we are worried that our tech dependency is going to be abused by the US government. In spite of your best intentions, I completely buy that you are democratic and open and you want to improve the world, but you are also commercial, and they can get you. And so that's the concern. So tell me, do you have any sympathies for any of this? Put ourselves in our shoes. Where do you think we need our own AI sector and we should push it for whatever reason?
Yeah, so there's a lot into that. So let me try to get into that. And it's an incredibly important question. And you'd be shocked to learn that I have had that conversation a number of times this last week. So I think first of all, and I think everyone here understands it, but it's good to reinforce. This is a productivity-driving technology as a baseline. There is a lot, talking about hangovers or overhangs, I think understandably in Europe for the last 20 years, a lot of the big US tech platforms have been effectively extractive. The social media companies, I think they did some good stuff, but effectively, others here can speak to it, right? A lot of economics were extracted from Europe.
And you guys actually generated competition on that in the search area, for example.
That's right. And what I think is different about AI than, say, social media is you can build things off of it. This is the electricity that's going into your system. What are the European cars, stoves, refrigerators, like the products that you're going to build off of this technology as you go forward. So there is the capacity to build a lot off of this. I think number 2, and again, I want to be incredibly humble and respectful. Right now there's 2 countries in the world that are able to build frontier models, large language models, and that is the U.S. and it is the People's Republic of China.
But before they came up with DeepSeek, we didn't really think they could do it either, right?
But they are. They are. I mean, they're
right. But maybe someone else will pop up,
Yeah.
and we're going to be just as surprised as we were with DeepSeek.
Maybe, but it takes enormous resources, of a scale that's really hard to get your head around, right? But I think your point is the right one, which is there's going to be multiple ones from there. There's going to be multiple ones from the U.S. I think the key is, and this is something I had referenced earlier, which is when people say sovereignty in Europe, what do they really mean by it? There's a variety of ways you can think about that, right? Is it that we do want to try to create a training model? But I think that's challenging, but certainly could think about it that way. Is it you just want to have a bunch of really good inference models that allow you to build all the developers, all the new companies, support all the stuff that you want, so that you're keeping the economics here, right? Ultimately, it's not the AI as an infrastructure is driving the economics. It's going to be what you build on top of that, right? And when I think of AI of, for, and by Europe, that to me...
So applications,
the applications, the developers, all the stuff that's building it into the legacy companies, all of that. There's localization, there's all that stuff that can come into it. Is it something as baseline as, hey, we want to make sure we...
So basically, you're saying that there is sort of this middle space between adoption and foundational
That's right.
technology, and there's a lot of innovation
look,
that can happen in that
there's
middle
people
space.
on this panel who spend a lot of their lives thinking about this, but there is a very strong sense that a lot of the value, economic value of AI is going to be in all these other places, right? The literacy piece comes into that, right? Like if Europe ends up leading the world on literacy and AI, it is going to be a dominant player on AI. And then the last piece, which is maybe the really going to the core of your question, I'm going to try to be an optimist, but try to be a little aspirational here, which is I do think in some ways AI can transcend some of the current conversations that are taking place. Like it's obvious that we are in some kind of a geopolitical moment. That said, this current administration definitely has a perspective where they understand that the world is either going to be built out on democratic-led AI rails or autocratic-led AI rails. And the democratic one is going to be one that's open, follows the rule of law, is transparent, allows people to actually use this for their individual needs to build, to create, to produce, to learn. The autocratic one won't as much. And so I actually believe in this moment that we're in, that this technology potentially actually provides interesting pathways for some of the relationships to be conducted through, because Washington does want to see the world built out on those democratic. I mean, you can almost go back 1944, Bretton Woods, right? Yes, it was the U.S. dollar, but it was built on a technology platform that allowed that to happen. And is there some version of this in the intelligence age?
Okay. Hope you're right. Okay.
I told you I was trying to be optimistic.
No,
so
it's
yes.
great. It's great. Okay, Simon, now I'm asking you in your capacity as a member of the French AI Commission. So you came up with this report to the French Prime Minister, right? And it has a big fact chapter called Sovereignty, Investing in Our Strategic Autonomy. So what's in there, and what's your take on this discussion?
So first, when I was in that commission, I had on top of my to-do list dependency from the US, digital perspective. And so I came to the statistics like, okay, let's find out. And actually, we don't know. It's crazy. We don't know. In the data on imports of services, which is not as good as for goods imports, imports of goods, sorry. Then you have one line, which is IT services. But in that box, you have an OpenAI subscription, you have a Microsoft Word, and you have an IT consultant that just helps you do whatever for your firm. So we don't know. We don't know if we are really dependent in all technologies, all digital technologies, new digital technologies, we don't know. And this is at the firm level. At the individual level, the fact that we are all using OpenAI or whatever, we don't know. We have nothing on the flow of services that come from the US to European consumer. And so this is a big deal, because now that we know that we are lagging behind the US, it's been like 20 years now, we need to know precisely where where to act.
Can I ask you to clarify why? I mean, you're really thinking like an academic who takes data seriously now, and I love that. But what we are used to here is effectively the business consultant approach. They say, "Oh, here's an industry. Here are the top players in the industry, and it turns out they are all American except for Mistral and DeepSeek." Why is that approach not good enough to just say we are dependent?
To just why is that good? Sorry. Why it's not?
Why is this not? Why do we even need data? It's so obvious that we all
yeah,
depend on ChatGPT.
Because we're on the AI. Actually, we are probably not lagging behind everywhere on the AI value chain. As you said, for instance, in implementation of AI, maybe we could be good at it, and so maybe we need to because I don't think that we can catch up with the US or China in LLMs. They are too far. I mean, they are too big to invest too much, and we invest too less. And so we need to target specific part of the AI value chain where we have comparative advantage. Maybe energy, for instance. I come from France. We have nuclear energy. It's not very carbonized. Maybe that's where we need to put data centers. We have a comparative advantage on this. And so if we don't know where we are dependent, we don't know where to invest, and we are budgetally constrained in Europe. We all know that. So
yeah, fair point. Okay, Dominique, we want to wrap this up relatively quickly because I do want to leave time for questions. But we have a quarter of an hour left. So feel free to comment on any of this. But I have a specific question for you, which has to do with the economic security part of this sovereignty debate. So there is this one idea which I find intellectually extremely attractive, is that you can reconcile international openness and specialization, right, which we know. So the point is, even if we develop a much stronger tech sector, I mean, what Simon is implying is, you know, the efficient equilibrium will involve specialization. So we are going to remain dependent, even if we are far stronger than what we are now. And then the question is, how can you then avoid Trump, using this as a choke point? And so one idea that I find quite attractive is to exploit the fact that, you know, companies like Chris's are the good guys in good times, right? Unlike some of the Chinese companies that are effectively controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, even in good times, right? So can we work with these companies to find technological solutions which effectively are commitment devices that stop Trump from interfering with them in the bad times? So maybe that involves having the data center in Europe. Maybe that involves having a sort of access to a technology or to a service that it can simply not be controlled out of Palo Alto or wherever you guys are, San Francisco, right? And you do in effect what Apple seems to claim it is doing with respect to privacy on the cell phone, that even they couldn't crack I don't know if that's true, but that's essentially the vibe of what we are saying. Is there such a thing?
It's certainly what businesses want. Businesses want choice. There's this argument, of course, that sovereignty is binary, right? It's either it's sovereign or not sovereign, and it was made very persuasively in an FT article I read the other day from a Stanford professor. And what businesses don't want is sovereignty to equal isolation, right? They want two things really. They want control and choice. They want control over their data and assets, and they want choice to be able to, to be free to be able to choose different providers. And what they've told us. A survey we ran said that since so-called Liberation Day, since the imposition of US tariffs first time around, 60% of large companies are now looking more closely at sovereign solutions for depending on what their needs are, and those needs, as I said, have changed over recent months. And what we are, a point now where companies want what we call a continuum or a spectrum, right? So you look at that, what you need in terms of sovereign AI, but based on how critical your workloads are. So you might use, local, private cloud AI solutions for critical workloads, lower risk stuff where innovation and performance is paramount. Then you might go to secure public cloud.
But my point, Dominic, is whether you can get these sovereign solutions from large American companies, essentially by contracting on a particular technology where they throw away the key or they give us the key, and we still have access to them, even if Trump jumps up and down in the White House and forces them, right? So no torture of Chris or his bosses will cut us off from ChatGPT, because the technology has been shaped in a way that makes this impossible. That's the idea.
So Chris probably knows better than me. There's
Yes.
two things I'd say. One is air-gapped solutions, so that's one thing, right? So that's one thing. The only other thing I'd say is that there is a debate around the code, right? So essentially, what happens? The code sitting behind any of these models.
Right.
Can someone pull the plug? Who's sitting in the White House? That I'm afraid I don't know. That
Chris?
Chris would know better.
I think a couple, and Dominic, I think you're sort of hitting on some of this stuff. But one, we've talked about air-gapped or on-prem, right? So if you're thinking about this,
Can you just
yeah, I'm
expand
sorry.
this briefly?
I was using that
Sure.
the language. So if you're thinking about this from like a government national security perspective, you can have your own basic compute that is air-gapped, meaning it's not on any system. You've sort of taken the IP. Now, the U.S. would have to be comfortable with the IP going over there, right? But once it's over there, if it's on-prem, then that entity, that government entity, controls it. That's how most of this technology
What does
works.
prem mean?
On premises, sorry.
Premises,
I keep using,
sorry.
Yeah, on premises, meaning that it's in total physical control. Right. And that's just not for AI. I mean, that currently exists in a variety of ways. I mean, there's U.S. tech companies that provide support on national security, intelligence, other types of very sensitive issues to European governments that are on the premises of those governments and air-gapped and sort of. Then you have, a version of this where, and Dominic was outlining this, which is you have a local inference place with local players, and they do all the stuff that you would do, local data retention, all of that. And, companies like ours are, in effect, just buying the off-take to deliver it to other places, right? That allows more of the control to exist with those local developers. Now, again, you want some of that, the actual design and development of that data center to be built with the right kind of IP, so you're getting the right type of compute coming out of that. Mm-hmm. There's a third version of this, and you can argue this both ways. We certainly do it, which is open sourced, which is really open weights. Right. We have an open weights model that exists globally. People can build off of it here. I think there's questions as we go forward, or everyone goes forward on this.
ChatGPT itself is not open weight.
No,
right?
but our underlying IP is made available in an open weights model, and there's all sorts of companies in Europe and around the world who are building off of that. So that's another version of thinking about this.
Okay.
I think just to be clear on the open weight, because I think it's an important issue, is we've gotten really conflicting information from governments on this, right? As the models become more powerful, right, you're going to want to really build standards into it from a public safety and responsibility perspective. And so you're going to have to think about that open weights from that perspective, right? There's a version of this where you just sort of keep a relatively modest open weights model, which would probably serve most folks as the frontier models get more power. But that is an issue you would need to figure out.
Yeah. So that basically there could also be security trade-offs,
That's the trade-offs.
So
right? Again,
one thing that protects you from Trump may not protect you against a terrorist, effectively, right? That sort of thing. I said that. Not
yeah,
you.
I didn't say that. Yes.
I know.
Yes.
Okay. Look, Deborah, I'll let you talk, but when we come back, okay, I do want to take a few questions, but we do have Slido, and the code is #FutureAI, future capitalized and AI capitalized, all in one word. But I'm hoping for questions from the room. Let's take one round. Okay, gentleman over there. Then I have the gentleman over here. Is there a lady for me, please? Yes, there's a lady over there in the back. That will be the initial round. Then we'll see if we can do more. Please identify yourselves.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing. Hi, Chris. Hi, everybody else. David, we briefly spoke on LinkedIn. I was fascinated by an essay you wrote, Chris, published, I think, just last week, advice you'd given to candidates running for the midterms in the US. And one of the pieces of advice that I was particularly sort of taken aback by was one of your big ideas there is connected to my work, because I forgot to introduce myself. David, work in tech, workforce development, and employment policy. And there was an advice about how companies should, in a sense, work more closely with governments and give back more to society. And some of the ideas that I think were great that you proposed was that potentially part of profits, especially in the context of maybe reaching AGI, which I know is something that Sam Altman speaks often about, could be redistributed to society for retraining programs for UBI and other sorts of safety nets. I'm actually very curious, given that my work focused on how we protect people who could be left behind by this transformation, what other safety nets do you think on top of reskilling and UBI?
Okay, thank you. Lady in the back, please.
Thanks. I'm Natasha from FGS Global. Something you said at the start, Chris, really struck me. You said it's not just about adoption, it's also about adaption. And I just wanted to know if any of you have seen anything that particularly drives adaption, either at the individual level or at the business level. And then conversely, are there anything that particularly acts as an obstacle to that adaption?
When you answer that, you should explain what the difference is. The gentleman in the front, please.
Hello, I'm Linus. I'm from Spark Technologies. We work with AI for public affairs. And my question is for you, Mr. Lehane. How do you and your team work with public affairs with AI? Is it mainly, monitoring and doing traditional workflows, or is it also a big part of the strategical decision making?
Okay, so the Brussels lobby industry is hoping to get revolutionized by you guys. So
we have a lobbying bot that's all ready to go.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So we have. I think all questions were for you, but if you guys have any comments, you should jump in.
Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, let me take particularly the first two. I actually think I can potentially pair together, but please jump in here. First of all, I do want to give a compliment to you run a very good program here. I mean, I did not see a single person actually really like on their phone or texting. That's very impressive. That's awesome. On the question, the first question, David, so just quick context, I put out a document last week. It was a memo I did in my personal capacity. As you noted, I used to work in the Clinton White House. I spent a big chunk of my life running campaigns, Senate, gubernatorial, presidential in the U.S., and so I still, on the Democratic side, so I still have a bunch of folks who call and ask. And in the U.S., the policy debate on AI has basically been this artificially binary choice. On one hand, there's one group that sort of say, don't worry, everything's going to be great here. In 5 years, you're going to be, living a great life. You're going to be painting watercolors. You're going to be living on the beach. It's all going to be perfect. And then on the other extreme, you have, a group that, the doomers who basically say this technology, and I'm doing a caricature of this to a degree, but this technology is so dangerous and so powerful that only a small number of people should control it. They happen to be them. Which I found profoundly elitist and non-democratic. And I had a bunch of candidates calling me saying, look, neither of those policy approaches are answering the mail when I go to my town halls or when I go talk to real voters or when I'm doing, a media interview. And so they'd been asking me, and I'd been sending texts and emails and responding. I finally said, I'll just put it into a memo. But the provision that you are calling out, I had a number of things in there. One of them, by the way, which I do think would be really consistent with the European Enlightenment approach, was actually thinking about AI as a fundamental right. And if you think about rights that get established through different economic periods, thinking about if you made that a right for individuals, the policy that could drive. But I think what, David, you were hitting on was, we had suggested, look, it's a little bit self-serving for OpenAI because, as I shared in the deck, we're managed by a nonprofit, and almost a third, roughly 30%, of our economics go into that. So that's effectively, the public aligned on that. So, I have the benefit of actually working in a place that is structured that way. But the case in there was, over history, particularly the history of capitalism, corporate structures have evolved to do a better job of calibrating labor and capital. Simone, much better at talking about this than I am. And, S Corp allowed for a lot of investment in infrastructure. Netherlands here, throughout Europe, allowed people to participate. You got LLCs, limited liability corporations, which allowed the railroads to be built initially in England because you spread and you were actually able to democratize access to it. In the U.S., public utilities were created to make electricity available at a rate that a normal person could pay for. You even had the Rural Electrification Agency, which spread it out, to rural areas. And I do think that it's worth considering whether, given the speed, scope, scale of this technology, do you need to think about corporate structures, both in terms of designing them so that they are building with democratic principles in mind and required to do so, as well as aligning the economics in a more direct way. So let me connect that to the other question, because I do think this is where I think, David, you were asking, in effect, there's going to be some people who are really good at this. I'm extrapolating a little bit, but some people who are really good at this, or companies that make a bunch of money, and those who maybe are not, and how are we thinking about those who are not? And I do think, thinking about how you're allocating the economics to help with that transition is incredibly important. But the question, I think was it Natasha, I think your name was? I'm trying to remember. Apologies if I got it wrong. A really smart question on who does this well. And like this technology is, and it's what attracted me to OpenAI, is inherently small d democratic. It does level the playing field. It does democratize knowledge and the ability to use that knowledge, but it really rewards people who take agency to do that. This is going to be an incredible technology for people who want to take agency in their lives. Like just two short stories. You don't have to be a technologist. I have a buddy that I went to high school with, never went to college. He owns a small little home building construction firm in the state of Maine. He called me at some point last summer, early last fall, and said, "Hey, dude, I can't believe this chat." All sorts of things were going through my head about how he was using it. And I called him up, and it ends up being that he uses it to make bids for projects that he never would have gotten in the past. He works all day. He has kids at home, right? Another woman that my wife knows, who immigrant to the U.S., had been working in a nail salon, wanted to open up her own nail salon, doesn't really speak English all that well, was able to use the tech to do the whole compliance, to do the application, to get a license. So people with agency are going to use this technology. The question, I think, is for those who don't have that agency. In the U.S., we have this line, those in the shadows of life, or the dusk of life, or the dawn of life. There's going to be people who don't have agency, and I do think that we really need to think about how that corporate design works, how we think about this as a right, how we think about some of the outcomes and things like healthcare and education, so that, in effect, you are trying to create some transitional paths here. And then the last, I'll do this really fast, but please.
I think you implicitly answered that question.
I was just going to say, that's how we think about it.
The lobbyists, by definition, have agency, so they should be fine.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We actually, I didn't do one for this, but one of my favorites is we do create bots of folks that we're sometimes doing interviews or media with, as a good way to practice. That's one of my favorites. But we use it in a bunch of ways. I'll talk to you afterwards. But you guys should jump in here.
Any comments on this side? Dominic?
Just on adoption versus adaptation, I'll be very simply, adoption is kind of level 1 and adaptation is level 2. Right. So think about adoption is how do I use AI to make my factory run more efficiently? Adaptation is, do I even need a factory anymore?
Right. Okay. Simon, please.
The debate around AI and inequality.
Yes.
Because, we had this idea that maybe it could be inequality enhancing. And we had this first wave of papers in the 2010s, STEM jobs. Like AI is profitable for STEM jobs, and it's increasing inequality. And then with generative AI, we have some evidence that it could be inequality. It could diminish inequality. This work with Eric Bridgelson and co-authors showed that people that were less productive actually increased more their productivity than people at the top. Why? Because AI is mimicking the behavior of the top guy in the firm. And so if we consider that AI will do this task and it could just reduce inequality, and then that's why we need to we need to think about it, because if it's inequality reducing, then maybe all this debate about how should we distribute is not good anymore. But if it's inequality enhancing, then we need to have this debate. So
I think this is, can I make one more point on this? Because
sure.
The two examples I used was basically trying to you made it more eloquently than I did. But this technology, it can really democratize. But we as a society need to put those values into it in terms of how we deploy it. And I do think like one of the places that we really need to think about it, I think this is just foundational to this, is do we build AI literacy into our public education system?
That's right.
Right. I mean, in the U.S., and I think this is the case in Europe, I'm not as positive. I know in the U.S., the public education system, K through 12, was specifically designed to help train people to work in an industrial age, right? Even like the bells, how you move from room, it was all designed to acclimate people emotionally, teach them the basic skills so they could work in factories. we have to think about what is the version of that, for this intelligence age, both in terms of just sort of AI literacy in terms of, but that agency piece, right? If you know that you can use this to compete with someone else, right? Some of the safety and responsibility pieces that come with it. But I do think those societies that start to build this in from an educational perspective are going to put themselves.
Maybe one way of making your point, and I was listening to your co-author who made something similar, is that we could expect it to have very large individual level effects, right? And either putting individuals at an advantage or a disadvantage, but these effects are less obviously correlated with income levels or with skill levels than previous technologies, right? But there will still be dislocation, and hence you can either try to minimize the dislocation by basically teaching everyone how to use it and in a sense offset personality, traits, agency, or you will need strong labor market institutions, and we're not quite sure that we have those ready in Europe.
I mean, like a simple way to think about it is if anyone who has a phone is going to have the same amount of AI power right now as Bill Gates.
Okay, great way to end. All right, I think it has been a great discussion. I really do. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Not at all, Chris. Thank you, Simon, Dominic, and Deborah. Thank you, and we.
Thanks, everyone.
We didn't use AI. Well, you did. Your presentation.